Hello everyone, Justin with Deep Dive Stocks here, and today we're going to be watching a video that is a recording of the live chat that we did last week, where we go over some reports and highlight some pretty unusual and interesting VoEx behavior, and we go over quite a few interesting things, I think. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started, and I hope you guys enjoy. Goodbye. Let's get started. If more want to join, they'll come in. So I was just going through reports and found a few that caught my eyes and I thought I would share. The first is here is Apple. Now there's, I think, some fresh faces here that may not be too familiar with VoEx. So just a quick recap. VoEx is this magenta line here. Oh, good. Already, is this pink line here? That's VoEx daily. The tan line here is what we consider VoEx trend. And we have two lines. We have the top line, and we call that the inhibition line. And we have the bottom line, and we call that the propagation line. And they're named because typically when VoEx gets into these zones, the price action, the lines are named after the characteristic price action CPRX. How did I know you were going to ask for CPRX? I've been meaning to look at it too, though. So the lines and the zones are named after what the price typically does once VoEx gets into the zone. So we see here VoEx is in the inhibition zone, price is going up. So the consequence is the price falls, hence the name inhibition zone. And I guess I'm just going to ramble. I don't know if I'm going to rant about CPRX. CPRX kind of has hurt my heart these past few weeks, falling out of favor. And so yeah, I'm just going to rant. So, chime in if you guys want or whatnot. But one of the cool things about VoEx is there are some particular patterns that we can keep an eye out for when we're monitoring a stock stability. And that's really all VoEx's job is, just tell us when a stock is stable and when it's not. So we saw that what happens when VoEx gets in the inhibition zone, the price typically falls. Conversely, when VoEx falls into the propagation zone, the price also typically falls because the natural outcome of a stock that is unstable is price depreciation. So we typically want the price, or VoEx rather, to stay within these two lines. And whenever that's happening, a stock is free to appreciate in value. But we'll see that over the past year or so, finding stocks inside of stability has become increasingly rare. But so yeah, so Apple here, obviously there's been some recent big news, but I think there's some pretty cool findings even earlier in Apple's history, namely right here. So another cool finding of VoEx is if we have the price, say this is the price is appreciating and VoEx is appreciating, such like here, we'll call that zone 1. And then say VoEx starts to fall, but the price continues to rise, such as like here, we'll call that zone 2. That's what we consider VoEx divergence. VoEx divergence is a pretty accurate finding. And what we typically do is once we see that the price is rising, VoEx is rising, but now VoEx is falling, as soon as it touches the inhibition zone, we typically get a massive downside movement, which is precisely what happened here on Apple in, when was this? Beginning of the year. And kind of what's cool is, like, in the beginning of the year, the market starts to tumble a little bit. So everyone blames the movement of Apple's price on the overall market conditions. But we see that the storm had been brewing for several months prior when VoEx was in the inhibition zone, telling us that the price was not stable. So that price appreciation was provoking too much instability on Apple, and the consequence was pretty standard. And here we see that large exaggerated VoEx movement from the propagation zone into the inhibition zone on a price appreciation, and that's naturally met with continued downside. So, and this is a pretty standard pattern where as the price depreciates, VoEx is in the propagation zone, And then we get like this little, bear market rally, and VoEx skyrockets into the inhibition zone, which tells us that price appreciation is provoking too much instability, that price is being worked against, and eventually you can never really fight the market and it breaks. So I think there's some pretty cool VoEx findings here on Apple. And it tells us that for a while now, the take home point here, how I take this is, for a while, Apple really hasn't been that stable, right? It's been showing signs of instability on any price appreciation. I mean, even this one, VoEx gets all spiky, immediately goes into, it only takes about a month, VoEx gets back into the inhibition zone. And then we see exactly when it gets in, starts spiking in the inhibition zone is the peak of the most recent price appreciation. VoEx quickly falls back to the propagation zone, and the price has declined since. So where do we go from here for Apple? Well, VoEx is in the the propagation zone. Seems to be deepening somewhat, but anytime VoEx is in the propagation zone, it's fair to say that a persistent and continued decline in price is likely. And sometimes it can be hard to gauge, over the next week, say the price starts to appreciate. Is this indicative of, is VoEx going to start to rise towards stability? What's going on? But we have this historical precedence that almost every time Apple has appreciated in price, definitely in the past year, this has been met with instability. So the question really becomes like, what are the chances that this time, right, is the good time? Like this time is the time that the price will appreciate in a stable manner. Hey, Latoya, long time no see. Right. So some pretty cool findings. Thank you. So I think there's some pretty cool findings on Apple. So yeah, it's VoEx. VoEx is in the take-home point. VoEx is in the propagation zone. Most recent price appreciations have all provoked instability. So there's really no like bullish outlooks here on Apple. No, that doesn't mean, from last week's weekly chat, we looked at like the distribution of the price movement when VoEx is in the propagation zone. And we saw that it did have like a rather large right tail, which means that a stock in the propagation zone can experience some pretty significant increases in price. But that's really more of a virtue of that instability that's present rather than like bucking the trend of the data. So VoEx is telling us unstable. We move on to the snap graphs, which the snap graphs are simply the algorithmic interpretation of VoEx. And so it simply tells us, is the price going to appreciate, or is it collects VoEx's recent behavior over these 3 time frames. So the 20-day, 10-day, 5-day, 1 day, that's 4 time frames. And then it looks in the past for similar VoEx behavior, and then it looks to see how that stock's price moved over the next same interval. So over the next 1 day, the next 5 days, 10 days, 20 days, so on and so forth. And it tells us the positive or negative association by putting these crosshairs either above or below the gold line. And so we see that on VoEx, or the snap graph agrees with us on the 10, 5, and 1 day that negative price action is the most likely. But it does suggest that on the 20-day, this VoEx behavior is reminiscent of some price appreciation. And if there's any questions, feel free to pop them in chat. Feel free to hop on voice. The hedging heat maps are pretty cool. Right off, they tell us the hedging environment on the stock, and immediately right away, we see that Apple is in a gamma squeeze, as indicated by the gamma being negative. We are right in the gamma neutral, which is slightly concerning, in that like typically an unstable stock that's in a gamma squeeze, you would like the crosshair to at least be touching some purchasing support so that those options dealers can be providing some passive bid. In this instance, Apple dropping down to like 135 is going to put it into some significant selling pressure. So as the stock drops, the options dealer have to sell more shares. This drops the stock's price more, so on and so forth. So, and then although the hedging heat maps themselves don't necessarily, they're not predictive of which way the price is going to go. They only tell us what's going to happen once the price gets there, and then we can infer, but the benefit is the influence distribution does have statistical relevancy when it comes to predicting the actual price movement. And we simply just look for the biggest piece, and we see that it is negative. So overall, on the short term, we have VoEx is saying it's in the propagation zone, which is always a classically negative indicator. We have these snap graphs that also agree with us. And then we have the hedging heat map so far that is saying that things don't look too bright for Apple. Now, the hedging heat map is really it's a beast of probabilities, right? Because we also see an almost equal probability of green, but it's blue here, but of positive movement. And so just like it would only take a movement to 135 to provoke massive selling, it would only take a movement to about 140 to promote that purchasing support. Excuse me. So in that instance, suppose Apple moves to 140, the options dealers step in, they start purchasing shares. As they start purchasing shares, the stock starts rising in price, which makes them have to start purchasing more shares, so on and so forth. But it looks like probabilities seem to be leaning on the downside on Apple. Nothing too remarkable here on the volatility and the top, this is the expected price range. And what these do is these dotted lines tell us what the market's expectation was for that stock's price movement. And typically we will see a stock well behaved, so they stay rather nicely inside of these dotted lines. So I guess the one trend reverse, or the one oddity, is that here we're well behaved, and even on downside, stocks tend to be well behaved, but here we see that both upside and downside are now not really listening to the market's expectations, despite an increase in volatility, which makes these dotted lines bigger. So that'd be curious to see like what changed here, because again, typically a stock, even on the downside, will be like respect these EPR bands. So what changed here, Maybe that's when Apple's gamma squeeze started, who knows? Shorting, nothing too remarkable. Shorting is actually decreasing, which is curious given the gamma squeeze. Sorry, I'm moving really quickly. So if there's anything you guys want me to slow down on or whatnot, I'm mostly just rambling, giving you guys an insight into how I look at these charts. Right off the bat, there's actually a pretty interesting finding. I'm calling it allergies, and that's what we're going to stick with. But this cough recently, these past few days. If anyone wants to quickly chime in on this part, so this is what we call the statics options graph, and this just tells us where the options are laid currently, and then we have the change in the options graph. So this gives us the change in that open interest per day. If the line is blue, that means that those positions were open. If the line is gold, it means those positions are closed. Sorry about that. So there's kind of two relatively interesting findings here. I don't know if anyone wants to chime in on which. There's certain patterns that we look for in these static graphs. And Apple has one of those patterns. There's also some.
I'll give it a shot.
Yeah, please.
Well, the first thing that stands out to me is on the right side of the changes in the difference in the open interest from the day prior. Quite a few deep in the money puts opened up.
These, right? These deep in the money puts.
And they're like racked out to maximum 200%. And that's a pattern that we've seen repeatedly lead to more downside in the past.
Yeah. It's a pretty confident shorting position, right? Like I didn't want to look at these reports all that much before the chat, because I kind of wanted it to be an organic discovery process, but I would be interested in knowing like the expiry? Like, are these delta heavy or vega heavy? So are they playing the actual price movement, or are they anticipating like a change in volatility? King Boo said, would sold to open show up there as well? Yes, yeah, they would. Any position opened or position being closed will show up regardless of the directionality of it. So it doesn't matter if it's sold to open or bought to open, it will show up.
Yeah, so to figure out what King Boo's asking, we would scroll down to the next section. But before we do that, I guess the other thing that stands out to me on the left side is the sort of distribution. Now, they both are relatively evenly bell curve shaped, but we look at the little red line, which is where the current price is, to see where price is relative to that bell curve. And we see that on the call side, we're, sitting to the, I guess if you tilt your head sideways, we're sitting to the right side of that bell curve distribution. And so a lot of the open interest is out of the money. Whereas on the put side, we're like smack dab in the middle.
Right. Exactly. And this is the inverted pattern, because typically you would want to see this pattern over here and then this pattern over here. I'm trying to figure out how I can make my drawings as confusing as possible. Any feedback is greatly appreciated. But typically you would want this to be the puts and this to be the calls. And then barring in mind, you would want this to be out of the money. But it's inverted because typically we have this nice normal distribution. I guess I'll draw what it typically looks like. That might be easier. So we would see.
So you would want the puts and the calls to be flipped, and you would want the puts to be inverted as well.
Exactly.
You would want the puts to be out of the money rather than in the money.
Right.
Yeah.
But here we have the opposite, and that normal distribution that we typically see on the options provides that very nice kind of just updraft, that natural, constantly providing this nice passive bid that kind of just floats stocks up and up. But the opposite is here with this inverted, we get this natural kind of float down mechanism. And so so by pure virtue of the orientation of these options, you will almost always have just a constant inhibitory force, like this constant passive. The options dealers are almost always providing a passive ask. So they're always trying to sell shares. But yeah, so inverted options layout, these strange in the money puts, a healthy chunk of new calls showing up. But the way that these graphs are designed too is that when we do see a bar that goes directly to 200, that means that strike is like a new open. So there were no options there before, or if it's like negative 200, which we don't have. But if it's positive 200, it means that there were no options at that strike before. Now there are. If it's negative 200, it means all of the options that were at that strike are now removed. So we put this as a bearish. We can put, these definitely have a delta of 1, so we can add that as a bearish. I mean, no one in their right mind sells super deep in the money puts, right? Like, you don't want to have to purchase Apple at $280 only to sell it at $140. Like, that's obscene. That's not, I would not recommend that that is not financial advice, but that is not something that I would recommend. Almost seems like a loss. So that's the options layouts. As Conway said, that although we can't look at if these are bought to open or sold to open, we can look at the change in delta, which helps us discern that a little bit. We can also look at so that used to be the old quick and dirty way before deep dive stocks developed the options directions table. And that tells us for each type of call. So for the out of the money long calls, we see that it dropped 62% today, which tracks because a whole bunch of out of the money calls closed. So 62% of the out of the money calls, or there's a difference of 62%. And then just to quickly go through, so we have, this is the daily change from the day prior. This is the 5-day average change, and then this is the 10-day average change. So we see that for the past 2 weeks, there's been a net increase in the dealer long out of the money calls, about 48% per day. For the past 5 days, that's gone up slightly to 77%. But on Friday, it did drop somewhat, negative 62%. So perhaps some of these were relatively short dated expiries. And just to recap, if you're a dealer long call, that means you're retail short. So that means retail, so like institutions, hedge funds, me and you, sold a whole bunch of calls out of the money. And then an options dealer bought them, so they're long those calls. Curiously, we do have a rather steady, although small in comparison, but of both long and short in the money puts. That might be muddied, that might be like swaps and stuff and like intraday stuff. The last thing really for Apple is we have this expected price range table. And just like the expected price range graph that gave us the dashed lines for what the market's expectations were, we can simply just forecast that a little longer. And like the EPR gives us the next day forecast, although sometimes it's hard to see if the movement is pretty extreme. But we see that the dash line goes a little bit beyond. So this would be like tomorrow. This is tomorrow's range of price. But because I don't expect you to bust out a ruler, and because I lost mine a while ago, I had to develop a way to get the numbers exact. And that's what the EPR table does. So it tells us that on Monday, a plus or minus 2.26% movement on Apple is what the market is expecting. So, and the EPR table honestly is pretty potent. I use it to gauge when I think movement, like if say I anticipate some stock is going to appreciate over the next month, and today is a pretty red day. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is look at the EPR table and figure out, was this a greater than expected movement in price? And so suppose I think Apple's going to go up on Monday or over the next week, and then on Monday it falls 1.5%. Well, as long as it's within the expected price range, I'm not too perturbed, right? But if it starts falling 3%, 3.5%, if it starts exceeding that time interval's expected price range, I start to get concerned because, well, again, stocks typically respect the expected price range bands pretty well. And so now I need to start digging into the data to figure out if did something changed, was my interpretation of the data correct, and then position accordingly. That's about it. I think 12 million shares have to be sold on Apple come Monday open, but that's not too like wild. We get that number by looking at the hedging matrix. So this tells us for every point increase in price and every point increase in IV, how many shares have to be purchased or sold. And we see the effects of the gamma squeeze here, where if the price appreciates, we have to purchase. And then if price, am I gonna be able to do this? If price depreciates, we get the gist. So if the price falls, shares have to be sold. If the price rises, shares have to be purchased. And that's the gamma squeeze that we saw exactly up here. But here now we have the numbers. So just checking to see. So yeah, any questions on Apple? What do you guys think about Apple? I don't think I'm going to buy Apple anytime soon.
I was never a fan, but that opinion was not shared by many people.
I will say, for as much as I've dropped my phone, and it's still with us, I think it's in terms of like the quality of the product. But all right, yeah. So overall, we have not too good of an outlook. Oops, not too good of an outlook. We'll put bearish there. I guess bullish and bearish both be able to be. So I need something a little bit more distinct. But for now, we haven't encountered anything bullish, so we'll just assume B means bearish. And the snap graphs are also pretty bearish. The hedging heat map tells us that there is a potential for quite a drastic movement on the upside. And the heat map, some people kind of mock me sometimes. They're like, oh, congrats, you said the stock could go up or down. It's really insightful. And Yeah, no, I get that. But, sometimes a stock moves 2% pre-market. And then the next thing you know, Apple's opening up on Monday morning at 140. And everyone's like, oh, it's going to fall. Well, it's going to mean revert. Well, maybe, but it's also now encountering some significant purchasing support. So maybe we pump the brakes on just immediately going short on Apple, expecting it to mean revert. EPR, something definitely has changed, such that Apple is no longer respecting the expected price range bands. Someone is also expecting, I would agree with Conway, someone is expecting a downside. I mean, this is almost a pure short, right? Like if these deltas are essentially one. So you're essentially just another way of shorting a stock. And then that's about it. Gamma squeeze, delta has been, so another kind of point sometimes can be a little confusing, the delta table and how it works. So just go over that real quick. Each row has 2 bits of information. It tells us what if the current delta is positive or negative. And then it tells us the change in that delta as compared to the row before. So what we see here is that the current delta is negative and that it is 9% lower than it was on Thursday, because this is Friday's data prints. As well, on Thursday, the delta was negative and it was 134% lower than the average delta over the past 10 days. As well, the average delta over the past 10 days was negative, and it's 22% lower than the average delta over the past 20 days, or that's 20 trading days, so 1 month. And then the average delta over the past month, or 20 trading days, has also been negative. So we can maybe answer up here. We know that at least a month ago, curious, is when at least the gamma squeeze, right? So we've been in the gamma squeeze for at least a month, and that also coincides with the greater than EPR price movements. So I wouldn't be too surprised if somewhere here, actually, I would probably move that box back a little bit. I would say here, probably one of these days is when the gamma squeeze started. Gamma squeeze provoke downside, they provoke greater than expected price range movements. The only thing that is kind of missing that would be cool is we want to see, ideally we would want to see, anyone want to take a guess what we would see in the volatility, which actually isn't all that present on Apple currently. Gamma squeezes have a pretty unique, if you don't have directionalized data, one of the really interesting ways that you can find gamma squeezes is they are associated with the price going down, but also volatility going down, as opposed to the classic price going down, volatility going up. But Apple seems to have spared itself from that, it seems. Yeah, oh well. All right. Any questions on Apple before we move on?
I wanted to go back to that price and volatility relationship. Is this an accurate analogy? You know how people look at SPY and the VIX, and how when SPY falls, the VIX spikes? Is that a similar relationship here with individual stocks?
Yes.
Where we can treat IV as like the individual stocks, quote unquote VIX.
Yeah.
Okay.
So VIX is all VIX is I mean, VIX is kind of an odd product, but it's
yes. And it appears to be broken sometimes, but it has to do with the futures
yeah,
for volatility.
Yeah, and in some whatever Barclays proprietary like liquidity metric is, but
oh yeah,
I mean I don't know exactly what it is, but yeah, no, you can just consider like the VIX to be the IV of the market. Well, it's one particular measurement of the IV of the market. I'm not going to give too much away, although I think I'm not going to lie, this week's weekly chat is insane. And what I did out of a random thought was I applied the liquidity metric that's been developed for the LDPM metric. And then I changed it to where it's not a live metric anymore. Like it just tells it, basically I extracted out the pure liquidity measure. And then I applied it to Spine and 500 other stocks, and it's pretty nifty. And it's pretty what would I want to say? It's a pretty raw look at liquidity, but essentially, I don't know what my point here for that was, but yeah, you can consider IV to be very similar to VIX.
All right, cool.
But yeah, oh yeah, and LDPL, but VIX is options derived. Like it's some volatility surface like equation. They look at like the spread of the bid and the ask of like 4 different types of options plays, like a spread, a collar, a call, and then across like several different strikes and expiries. And essentially all they're doing is like sampling the liquidity environment at various points and for various activities. And then basically they average it, and then they're like, this is what the volatility is. So, but it's predicated on the options themselves. Like the VIX is an options-based liquidity metric, and which is useful if you know that, right? But like if you want to know, say I'm only interested in the liquidity of a stock based off of how the actual traders are trading shares. Well, the VIX isn't really that good of a representative. Like it's not really a good representative of that the liquidity environment. And then things get complicated because options dealers themselves quote liquidity. So they can, where there's poor liquidity and good premiums, options dealers will enter that area of the market and then provide liquidity, collect those premiums. And so there's always kind of this like weird snake eating the snake with VIX.
Gotcha.
Let's do, I don't think I do have it. I do think I have it. Hold on. FDX. I'm not gonna be able to write on this one, but boy. So VoEx fell into, well, let's look at overall. So yeah, just take a moment, take a gander at what's going on here. I'm actually, let me stop the share real quick. I'm gonna get this over to, because everything is better when I draw messy lines over everything. Cool. Every time I screen share, it says I have to install this plugin. Every time. I wonder where it goes. All right. All right. So what do we see here? It's actually pretty cool. Anyone see anything interesting?
Some wild behavior on the very left side.
Yeah,
in the middle to end of 2021.
So definitely some interesting VoEx behavior. Which, too bad Green Guy's not here. Yeah, Baxter said, whoa, I agree. So, which is pretty fast. So Green Guy is one of our members, and he is very good at pattern recognition, we'll call it. And he identified this particular VoEx behavior. And the name that has kind of been developing is VoEx Coiling. And we're going to see some of the stocks that I was looking at last night for this talk, just to kind of like find interesting ones for you guys. There's a very reminiscent behavior, and I'm curious if they're related, but I was calling them like VoEx stalagmites, because you got to hold on tight. Tights. I don't know how to spell stalactites. And the idea is VoEx is very jaggedy into the propagation zone, and it kind of reminded me like in a cave with all the stalactites overhead. And he laid out quite a number of examples where this behavior is almost always met with a price appreciation, which is curious that we see that here on FDX as well. So we have this kind of bizarre VoEx behavior, and then as soon as it starts shooting up, we see a very healthy price appreciation going along with it. And then what happens? So we appreciate in price, and uniquely, VoEx kind of calms down, right? It goes from being extra spiky to less spiky, and then it kind of starts, we see especially VoEx trend, it just starts hanging out inside of stability. During its tenure inside of stability, the stock rises pretty steadily. I mean, it's a rocky road for sure, but overall price appreciation. And then right on September, it seems like VoEx fell back into the propagation zone, and then lo and behold, we dropped. How much did FDX drop? An obscene amount. And his FDX, I think, was also one of the stocks that we did the E3 earnings algorithm on, right? Am I making that up?
So actually, we did that after the big drop. That big drop, FedEx, this was before earnings. They had announced that not only was domestic US activity dying down, but global activity was dying down in a meaningful way. And as a result, FedEx stock dropped precipitously. And then earnings happened, and then FedEx did drop, but it was a slight drop relative to
the massive drop.
yeah.
But no, thank you for that recap. So, but we did successfully capture like $40. It was a $40 drop. That's pretty insane. The E3 announcement did allow us to capture some little bit of gains. But what's curious, and it kind of reminds me of that time that on Twitter, the VoEx goes wild on Twitter, and I had a hunch that it was about a month before the news became public that Elon Musk was quote unquote buying Twitter. And I was curious to see if when VoEx started going crazy, if that actually lined up with, because if whenever you're a billionaire and you buy 100 million shares of something, you got to report it to the SEC. And in a very interesting way, 2 days after the SEC filings, VoEx starts going crazy on Twitter, which was exactly 1 month before it became public that he was going to quote unquote buy Twitter. But it's curious that we see this massive drop, but we also see VoEx dipping into the propagation zone slightly before. So I'm curious, I wonder if someone, because we see previous like here to here, it's not that big of a price drop, and we've seen FDX has done that before and VoEx really didn't budge, right? So previous similar movements in price without provoking VoEx into the propagation zone, but it also just so happens to be that several days before certain news becomes public, the price does drop, but this time VoEx decides to head to the propagation zone. I'm just curious. The current finding, though, is that, I mean, there is some resemblance that VoEx is moving up back into stability. So this does infer some potential long-term upside. One of the rules that I use when I'm trying to decide if if VoEx moving into the stability is like, if I'm comfortable enough going full long, is the longer it's spent in the propagation zone is kind of like the same amount of time that I like to see it inside of stability, just because some stocks can get, and then maybe it's not a good example, but some stocks can rise back into stability, and then a week later VoEx plummets and the cycle kind of rinses and repeats. VoEx is good, but it's not a clairvoyant. So depending on how conditions change on the foundation of the stock. So, but currently it does seem that VoEx is going up slightly, and we've had maybe a few days of price appreciation. So maybe worth keeping an eye out for it. Overall, though, it seems like a super rocky stock. I feel like this is the type of stock that would just give me too much anxiety to trade, so I just wouldn't do it. Like constant, like stocks don't typically have this many VoEx spikes. Ideally, that's the ideal situation. The snap graphs do not necessarily agree with this anticipation. Negative on all 4 timeframes. And we have, so just to go over a little bit more of the, I guess, of the snap graphs, some of the components. The pink dots are just the individual data points. So you can see if they're nicely clustered or if they're kind of like a mess. Typically, you want to see like this nice hourglass shape. And you don't want to see, you want to see a few dots here and a few dots here. And then we get the overall model, which is this line. And then we get this line, which is the 95% confidence interval. So that the shaded region tells us where our 95% confidence is. And as long as the crosshairs aren't, sometimes like the crosshairs will be here. Well, then we need to pause and say, well, the current data print is neither in line with the models, like all of the historical precedents, and it's way outside our 95% confidence interval. So maybe we need to take the snap graphs with a little bit of a grain of salt. It's kind of why I keep all of that on the graph so that you have access to all that data. I don't want to just be like, yeah, the snap graphs have pretty remarkable like statistical accuracy, but like I want you to make that decision on whether or not, and on this stock, the snap graphs are worthy. Because we see like here, like we see the individual data points don't have good clustering, right? They're kind of just strewn all over the place. Like they don't have that nice morphology that we would want. So on the 20-day, you'd be like, maybe I want to go look at some other data. Ooh. So what's unique about this gamma hedging heat map is that the main determinant on if we sell or if we buy isn't the movement in price, it's the movement in IV. So if liquidity increases, if volatility decreases, we have to sell. And then if volatility increases and liquidity decreases, we have to buy. And so this is a Vanna squeeze, something that is very not talked about often, but they exist and they're pretty nasty. This one is a self-limiting one because as selling occurs, this will drop the price, but it'll also raise the volatility. So we move in a direction like this. And eventually we will meet some purchasing support, which will raise the price, drop volatility. And then so essentially we just end up in this nice little loop. And this is in contrast to the heat maps that are opposite. So if this were blue and this were red, that's concerning because as the price drops and volatility rises, it would get more red, which would drop the price, raise volatility, and then we would just plummet down. This is a pretty stabilizing Vanna squeeze, but they can still be pretty gnarly. And of particular note is that the FDX will open Monday morning immediately inside of selling pressure, which is curious that the influence distribution still anticipates positive earnings, or positive price movement. But it is worth noting that this what would be called like a tail event is pretty significant. Like, so how much the distribution, how high it is over the the negative side is higher than you would want. So if this is our influence distribution, and say we would kind of want something that looks like this if we want to be, like nice positive, say it's +1. But once you start increasing the height of this tail, then that suggests that the outcome of a pretty massive decrease in price is becoming more and more likely. Worth noting. And it's extended out, right? So it goes beyond the -2, whereas the positive, the purchasing goes to. So like, not only is there a tail event, but that tail event actually has greater potential selling pressure than there is available purchasing support. Kind of the details, but potentially. As one might expect, the massive drop in price did exceed the expected price range for, I don't know, was that one day? Yeah, it kind of looks like it.
Yeah, the bulk of the move happened, I think, in the extended trading hours session.
Oh, did it really?
I believe.
That's curious. I want, because just the liquidity is super bad in those. So there's always like the potential, like it always has the potential to move the markets way more than it should. I'm curious though, like if I were to dig more into this though, I want to know why all of a sudden this changed. Like, why is IV decreasing? Then all of a sudden, not only does IV reverse course, but it does so with like quite the vigor.
I'd like to see if somebody ended up taking up a position as well. Did somebody know something? That's the question.
Yeah, something, because let's see.
If you go straight up, look, yeah, it starts going down outside of the EPR. You know, it's like making extended downside moves pretty much on day one. Then recovers a little bit back into the dotted zone, and then just persistent declines.
Yeah,
Larger than expected movements. Like, I would not be surprised if somebody knew something, or if somebody had positioned very, very opportunistically at or around that date, mid-August.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's kind of strange. Which is, I wonder, wait, so that's is that middle of August? Is that when?
Oh, that's when that spike occurs.
Yeah,
Look at that.
I'm kind of curious.
I mean, curious is not the word that I would use, but this is a common pattern.
Also, this one is for my fellow medics in the audience. Sometimes VoEx makes me a little nervous. I'm like, ah.
That does look like a heartbeat.
Yeah, it looks to be more like a STEMI. So basically, how you would see a heart attack. But that is curious. So we have a shift right at the shift of the liquidity environment. VoEx spikes. Curious. Shorting definitely skyrocketed recently, but it is plummeting. Perhaps so, which is pretty. So shorting is one of those weird things where everyone says it's bullish, and perhaps it is on like the long term. Like, sure, eventually everyone has to cover their shorts, supposedly, but on the short term, I mean, it's a very, very bearish indication, right? Like, you don't open a large short position. By Latoya, you don't open a large short position if you think the stock is going to go up, right? But shorting is decreasing for what it's worth, and that's the short ratio. So that takes into account, that's just shorting over volume. So you don't have to worry about like how much volume is changing. It just gives you a pure, just a nice pure view of the amount of shorting going on. Ooh.
Same thing.
Same with this. It's been pretty fascinating watching the change in the options layouts throughout the past like year or so. It used to be that, I mean, there's a whole chapter dedicated to like the options patterns, and they used to be reliable, like incredibly reliable. Most of my like plays were based off of just options plays. But as the market conditions deteriorated, like things have just, even the structure of the options environments throughout the market have deteriorated. But now I'm starting to see this formation is the predominant one that I'm kind of just seeing over and over again, which is worth noting. I don't really have an answer as to why or like necessarily what that means, but it is a curious observation. Tons of calls and puts being closed. A staggering 6,000 shares will have to be sold. That's a very curious number. I imagine that delta, sometimes if delta is very low, then like a change from 5 to 100 is like 1,000,000%, right? I try to control for that with some math trickery, but it's not always possible. But we have been in a gamma squeeze for at least a month. And then tomorrow's expected price range is plus or minus 2.12%, which isn't terrible. There's our in the money puts that seem to have been retail long. So someone did purchase those puts. Healthy call, out of the money call, selling by retail. So this alone is pretty bearish. Again, we haven't really met a bullish outlook yet, so B just stands for bearish. So here's findings. Any questions on FDX? Cool. All right, let's do. No, I don't want to rank you. You do?
Is it time for that CPRX rant?
Not quite. Actually,
I'm less interested in CPRX, what it's doing now and what it's going to do into the future. I'm more curious about what you saw in it in the first place before it went up, 3 or 4 times its price. Because that was a great play.
No, it was. Thank you. There really wasn't any magic in it. You know what it was? I think a long time ago when I first joined Robinhood, I think CPRX was the free share they gave me. So it always just kind of sat there for the longest time. And I think that, and then deep dive stock started to get the metrics. So it was just kind of a stock that I always gravitated towards just to look at what was going on. And I just started noticing the patterns that are outlined in the trading primer, where you would, not only was VoEx doing some crazy things, but you would see these very distinct movements in the options environment that then also mapped to the changes in VoEx. And after like 2 or 3 times of kind of witnessing that, I just decided to basically go all in, pull the trigger, and capitalize on the repeating pattern. And it went from like $5 to $15. And recently when I accidentally bought those few hundred shares of it, I was like, this is fine because I think it's going to go to 20. But as I was watching it, the VoEx dipped into the propagation zone, and then the options layouts change, like they weren't following the same pattern that they typically follow. And that's why anywhere in life, and especially the market, repeating patterns are good until they're not. And I'm quick to abandon if it looks like there's a portion of this pattern that is not congruent with the pattern. And so as soon as I saw, I think it was, I don't have here, let me pull up the report. My poor baby CPRX. So it was rising. Rising nicely. VoEx did this weird thing, and that at first I was like, okay, this is good because VoEx typically spikes. We see it in the September 2021. we see it in the February 2022. And typically this is met with continued price appreciation. But when I looked at the, oh, that's healthy.
Okay. You and the word choice.
So, okay. But I noticed this was changed. This is actually pretty helpful. Like, so like I said, I haven't looked at this actually in a few days. But the out of the money calls started closing, which you traditionally want them to open and you want them to be retail short. And then the immediate out of the money puts were opening that were retail long. And that was just literally the repeating pattern that kept happening over and over again. But when VoEx fell into the propagation zone, a lot of the out of the money calls closed and deep out of the money puts opened up. And that was my signal to dip. But curious, so this is actually a healthy options layout though, right? We have this nice, I mean, as much as you can with only like 2,000 options, but we see that nice normal distribution on the call side where the largest strike is slightly out of the money. And and we have positive delta, so that's beautiful. The puts have their largest strike at just out of the money, and we see that at 12.5. And there is a I mean, that is what it is. There's some immediate out of the money puts being opened. There are some out of the money calls being opened. So curious, CPRX might be getting back on the horse. But that was really all it was just kind of like spending time with the data and just seeing this repeating pattern kind of repeat and deciding to capitalize on it. Gotcha. It always has the most interesting options layouts too. And that's, it's kind of the paradox too of people. I think when I kind of first started introducing this data to the world, one of the criticisms were that I do focus a lot on options. And so I think there's this implicit assumption that it's kind of all that is incorporated in these data. And so if a stock, for instance, like CPRX only has 2,000, 6,000 options, how accurate can the data actually be? But I actually think that there's a little bit of a hidden paradox here, because you find that the less hands that are in the pot, the more direct, like these options are being placed by professional traders, right? Retail isn't dipping their hands here. And that actually incurs a lot of safety in some of your assumptions. That is thankfully backed by the data, but you can, when you see these deep out of the money calls being opened up, because you know that this isn't the stock isn't really known by retail at all. So these are dealer long call, or these are dealer short calls, or dealer long calls, I'm sorry. And because the predominant type of call that gets opened in a bullish environment from hedge funds and institutional trading is they sell calls on equity. And so you almost have this like weird paradox where the less options typically means the less hands are in the pot, which means typically the hands that are in the pot are these quasi-professional or professional traders. And so they tend to follow, quote unquote, quote, like the rules a little better than retail does. Is CPRX gonna, is it time to, I think ideally I would like to see it, maybe I would like to see it maybe go above 15 before pulling the trigger. Above 15, I want to see the 12.5 puts move up to 15, and then I would pull the trigger. So ideally, and this is kind of the same thing. So I just, over the next few days, I want to see that these the 12.5 puts start to close, and then the 15 puts start to open. Flow for CPRX is bullish as hell. Yeah, I mean, that tracks. This is a surprisingly stable stock. Like, it has beautiful, it does have 151 short, but we won't focus too much on that. It does, I mean, it hasn't ever gone into a gamma squeeze. 0.028 put to call ratio. That's pretty cool. Yeah, I mean, and we could see that here, and it's providing nothing but nice juicy long delta. It's very well, it respects the EPR bands very nicely. That purchasing support is beautiful. Right, yeah. So all right, time to keep an eye on CPRX again. We shall see.
I didn't mean to, but yeah, the LDPM is also positive and bullish on the daily chart on CPRX. I mean, it's been bullish for 3 days, went bearish for 1 day, and then flipped back to bullish on Friday. So we'll see what happens one day, I guess.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, I'm not hesitant. I'm not resistant. It's a good stock. I have no idea what it does. I don't even know the name of the company, but
we'll keep it that way.
Huh?
We will keep it that way.
Yeah, I don't want to know. Sometimes people would contact me or message me, and they're like, what's your opinion on this company? They're doing this, this, and this. And I'm like, I don't know. What stock is that? I have no idea. No idea what they're up to. But I guess we'll probably finish on this. We're approaching an hour, but I do want to, this VoEx I find to be very curious because it's besides the previous behavior, I mean, the price action alone on this stock is wild. And I mean, we have some nice VoEx spiking indicating the peak there. And then, but then this, right? Like this is very reminiscent of what we saw. Was it? No, what stock did we just look at? That was FDX. Oh, geez. Right?
Yeah, on the left side, yeah.
Yeah, so it's very reminiscent. And it looks like it's starting to go up, which if we want, we also see that I'll pull up some other, I have a whole bunch of, well, not a whole bunch, but I have been keeping an eye out for that. Hold on, let me check my notes before I'm just over here. I have been keeping my eye out for this just because it's, now that it's pointed out to me, I can't help but notice it. That wasn't it. Cool, it's all the ones I didn't bring in. All right, well, in any case, they're on the reports. But yeah, so the VoEx coiling or the VoEx stalactites it seems to be going up, and this is typically met with a pretty steady price appreciation. So it's just curious. It's a very curious, and which I think memory is telling me that I remember kind of putting this in the far recesses of my mind when I first started noticing this like 2 years ago, just because I actually don't know why this is happening. This is, do you have time to pull PBR? Yeah, I think I have PBR. I don't think the rest of this report is particularly, right, except for that. Quite abundant. Yeah, so nothing crazy going on, but this behavior, I actually don't know what's going on, and which always is kind of comical to me. I remember there was this one Reddit thread a while ago that someone asked me about something on VoEx, and I was like, that's the beauty. I was like, I don't know why VoEx is doing that. And then so then they made a post that essentially was like, this dude doesn't even know what his own tool does. But I love when VoEx does things that I don't know. It just, because it really is saying, hey, there's something super strange going on here, and you should go probably find out why. And so one day I will. But it does look like the VoEx is proceeding upwards. And as we saw with, I can go back to Dropbox and look at some of these examples, but we've seen both in the Discord chat with the green guys examples and on some of these reports that this is also typically met with a appreciation in price. Let's go look at PBR. I think I have that made. We made a staggering, we're up to like a consistent 700 to 800 reports a day, which is pretty, give me a second, which is pretty intense. So long story short, when reports started being a thing, I think on average, Deep Dive was making, I think at first only 100 or so reports, and it took forever. I think it took like 2 hours, and now we're at 700 and sometimes up to 800, and it only takes about an hour now. And there's a whole bunch of other processing that happens. It's pretty cool. PBR. A lot of stocks had very strange behavior towards the end of 2021. And that was definitely around the time that I was definitely waving, like if you guys think I waved my hands and rant now, I was definitely doing it then. Strange VoEx behavior here. We did drop it into the propagation zone, and we had a healthy price dip, but recovered.
That middle section is, excuse me, that middle section is, well, first of all, PBR is a petroleum company. It's energy, minerals.
I always thought it was the beer, I'm not gonna
lie. That's literally the first thing that I thought is Pabst Blue Ribbon, but I looked it up. But I wanted to point out that middle portion of the VoEx graph, that's February, March timeframe. That's when Russia invaded Ukraine, and basically every oil company under the sun saw a pop. And the smaller, more heavily shorted ones saw a huge gap up.
No, I did not know that. Very curious. I wonder. This is also, I see this every once in a while, this particular movement, and I call it the Batman. Something worth, maybe if you guys start noticing it.
I've definitely noticed it. I've been noticing it on LDPM as well, and meaning about it.
Oh yeah,
to myself, but you know, whatever.
But it's kind of like how a lot of these VoEx patterns get identified, because it also seems that there's been this sort of fortuitous timeline that we've been on with VoEx, where like in real time, me and then now you guys are experiencing VoEx in very different market conditions. When I started using VoEx, VoEx came online in its first version privately in like March of 2020. So I was seeing a lot of like recovering and then very stable VoExes. People weren't taking a lot of risk in the market. And then fast forward to 2021, when VoEx started going wild on almost every stock everywhere. And I knew what the data said, but then I'm watching all of this happen in real time in the market and kind of just being like, huh? And then now to see that instability manifest to the market downturn that is consequential, and then now watching the market kind of recollect itself and how VoEx behaves in that, I think this whole process has been fascinating. But with that, I think that there's certain VoEx patterns that become more common in these different environments, and I'm pretty fascinated by that. But yeah, I want to say overall, like it's in the propagation zone. Since then, the price has been dropping. Whenever I see like, so the hard question is, we meet a stock like this in the propagation zone and it's been in the propagation zone. So the question is always, did I miss the boat? Am I comfortable continuing to go short on this? And it is at times a hard question to ask, especially because I think, what was it, like the average time in the propagation zone is really typical. And now, mind you, this is like pre-2021, 2022 data. So maybe it's time to redo some of those analyses, but it was about 12 days, right? So, and we've definitely exceeded that. And what I do typically to answer this is I just quickly look at the past times that the price has appreciated, because that would be my my biggest risk, right? Like if VoEx is in the propagation zone, the price is dropping. So I go ahead and I enter a short position. Obviously, the risk is that the price will appreciate. So I look to see, at least in the nearby, what happened the last few times the price appreciated. And we see VoEx wasn't too happy, but not immediately so, right? Like I think we saw on Apple, like as soon as the price started appreciating, VoEx started immediately beelining it to the inhibition zone, right? And this was a pretty persistent theme. Like even here, VoEx gets all spiky during the price appreciation. But here on PBR, you don't really have that same level of like urgency. Like VoEx does move, but then even when, I don't know. So this doesn't give, this is one of those one of those situations where because ideally you want to see like price goes up, VoEx spikes, price immediately falls in the span of like a week maybe. And that's your real very nice, like, all right, I'll enter a short, and if the price appreciates, at least I know previously there's been a very strong response from VoEx and the market reacted accordingly. This response isn't personally as strong as I would like. And it is tolerated a little bit more than I would like. So it's not necessarily, so I would be concerned on entering a short position here. I think I would probably wait until VoEx enters back into stability. That's just me. But then again, the problem is VoEx inside of the propagation zone does infer consistent and persistent declines in price. So you have to count. So it's all about risk. What type of, where you want to capture your gains, I guess. Like I said, I don't think anything else on the PBR, or did we go through PBR? Oh, that's good. I mean, that's good.
Normal. This, well, actually healthy, not your ironic healthy comments. This is actually healthy.
This heat map is disgusting. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
But oddly, it isn't a gamma squeeze. I have a sneaking suspicion that the orientation of the gamma squeeze of the heat maps change before the delta or gamma actually becomes positive. But we do see a very nice, this is what we want to see, right? We want to see if the index falls, we have nice purchasing support, and then we do have some modest, pretty significant actually selling pressure, but we would have to make it all the way to at least $14 before we run into that. We do have quite a nice positive influence distribution, but we do have this little guy peeking ominously. What are you doing? Look at him.
It's like Homer Simpson hiding in the bushes.
Yeah, like don't notice me, but that's a pretty significant tail risk. And so, and this is so this is 0.4, so this is a 40% chance. That's a 40% probability. And this comes in at 50%. So the difference in this, in between the like significant left tail and positive price appreciation, is pretty narrow. EPR is pretty gnarly. Like it pretty persistently seems to like disregard the EPRs, that just becomes a headache when you're trying to position. Why bug dive mid og?
Bug, is that a stock?
Sorry, I can't type today. Big. Why? Oh, why the big? Oh, okay. Yeah, I was like, big, the stock? Did it dive? I don't know. I don't know why this keeps unsharifying me.
Are you talking about the implied volatility or the price? Because the price didn't dip that much, Baxter.
Oh, the volatility did dive, actually.
Yeah,
I'm not sure. It's pretty strange. I'm not gonna lie. So if we ever get this back up, volatility halved itself basically in the span of like, or maybe like a week or so. Yeah, I'm not sure. What did VoEx do during that period? Because sometimes like volatility disappears. So I think you're mentioning here. Yeah, who knows?
Market maker quotes that though, right? So you'd have to know what the market maker was thinking.
Yeah, sometimes a VoEx dove into the propagation zone then. So, and that's the curious thing, is that there's times when liquidity entering a stock is good and that's what you want, and then there's times where it's not, and VoEx interpreted that increase in liquidity as a very not ideal moment in time.
Yeah, I mean, that drop is stunning.
Yeah.
2 days, that's it.
I'll keep an eye out for you, Batman. All right, I do want to go. I want to show you guys real quick. I know we're now encroaching on an hour and a half, but look at that weird behavior. That's really all I wanted to show you. But again, look, end of 2021, VoEx is going crazy. Very classic thing you'll see. There was a stock that I saw yesterday, and I remember thinking, you need to write this down. And then I remember thinking, all right, I'll write it down later. And now I forget which stock it is. So here's the what I feel like is being seen on what was that stock that we looked at that had the VoEx flags?
Was it FedEx?
SIRI, maybe? Yes.
Oh, SIRI. Yeah, SIRI.
So, yeah, so see here. And then so we're kind of like on that up phase. And I noticed, and what you typically, or what I am now looking out for, is this up phase. So we have that downward trajectory with those spikiness. VoEx then pivots up, and we see at the same time the price does experience quite a significant price appreciation. And I think another cool example was here. Yeah, like fragmenty spikes headed down, shoots up, price appreciates pretty drastically. When is a pretty curious VoEx in and of itself.
There's a lot of history with social media and Wendy's stock in particular, because people like people like to meme when they intentionally misspell WHEN into WEN, and social media stock sentiment bots sometimes misinterpret that as people talking about Wendy's the stock.
Oh, that's
that's been a pattern we've seen at least a couple times over the past year or two, where there will be people just spamming when, like, oh, when is this going to happen? When is that going to happen? When Moon, when Lambo, when Tendies, and then just Wendy's stock will just randomly skyrocket.
That's hilarious, actually.
It is hilarious. Yeah.
It's pretty funny.
I mean, there's more hilarious stories with social media sentiment scrapers like that, with more vulgar terms that I won't get into, but it's been pretty funny seeing mainstream media say, oh, social media is talking about this stock, this company, and it's like not even a real ticker. It doesn't exist. It's like a vulgar word, and their social media apparently is, you know, pumping some imaginary company. That's been hilarious to watch too.
That is, you gotta love it. You gotta love technology. All right, let's do last one. Haha, another beautiful example. So VoEx spikiness headed in the propagation zone, and then kind of pivots, starts moving up, and the price appreciates pretty drastically. So maybe worth keeping an eye out for on SIRI, was it? Do I have the why do I have the memory of a goldfish?
It was SIRI, yes.
Okay, perfect. SIRI it is. So we're on the up phase here, which is, so then is there any indication of, so the thing is, if it is in the up phase, right, and it gets to $6, that's
a violent up phase.
That is intense, some might say. Especially, like, notice that it gets more intense. Oops, I'm gonna try to, because so that I don't have to keep looking down, I'm gonna try to learn how to draw by looking at the screen. Price up, you know, price up, volatility down has a much more purchasing than price up, volatility up. So,
you know, the ironic thing is that decade ago, I was an investor in SIRI. Back then it was
this is the radio.
I think so, yeah. And I held it for years and it didn't do anything. It just went sideways. So it's very interesting that it's now coming back into my life in this context. I'm like, oh, interesting.
That's funny.
That's the post-traumatic stress disorder from holding on to it for years and not seeing it doing anything. But I was young and I didn't know any better, so whatever.
I was young, investing in radios, you know. All right, last one, I promise. Because earlier I mentioned that these options layout patterns are becoming pretty rare in the market, or have been over the past year or so, except I found exactly one in almost all of the reports, and it was on UUP. And which is curious because
this is interesting.
Yeah, and UUP is actually a pretty, I mean, when you want to, not only does it have a options layout, it's like the only one I was able to find, it's also one of the only ones with a VoEx that is persistently inside of stability. And like, what a beautiful showing of the stock's price in the meantime. Now, it is worth mentioning that it has recently dipped a little bit into the propagation zone, so maybe some oh, but no, actually keep that in mind. Let's do a quick little dive, because so VoEx is instability, price is appreciating. VoEx is pretty, what's curious is this is another thing that I would look like, why in both cases price goes up, but here VoEx is very violent VoEx, we'll call it V squared. And then here VoEx is pretty like calm, right? And it's inside of stability. So almost exactly here, right? Like what changed? And that's why, and that's the type of like wanting to be able to look at this data quickly that inspired like the desire for the data dashboard, so that you can literally go on to February 2022 and start look a few days before, a few days after, and see like if there are any noticeable changes. But VoEx has recently dipped into the propagation zone. The snap algorithm, so this is the 20-day snap. So unfortunately, it's probably not even, it has this behavior in it, but it has such a long back window that it may not be registering necessarily. But we do see quite the anticipated positive movements. The more shorter term, like the 5-day, so this most recent behavior would have a little bit more of a significant impact, maybe even on the 10-day, are looking negative, which is slightly slow, pretty neutral on the 1-day.
Wow, look at that.
Look at that. What is this? What is it?
It's a Vanna squeeze, but also the red is on the right side.
Right. So this is one of those unstable Vanna squeezes where, like, if the price goes down and volatility rises, we end up here and then we keep going down. So we don't have that nice self kind of replicating cycle. But in the off chance that we do go up, but then we see that the peak of the influence distribution is on the negative side. And then so bearish, and then we get here. Finally an options layout. What options layout pattern is this? It's gonna hurt my heart so much.
I'm still working my way through that to that primer.
I know you jumped headfirst into the VoEx and the options stuff, but that's fine. But again, like, I don't blame anyone because the options layouts haven't been all that prominent lately. But this is the loan option layout, and they all have fun names. It's an equal amount of calls and puts at exactly the same strike, but you also typically want very few other options. And typically in a healthy environment, the stock's price will simply rotate around this strike. And whenever it goes up, VoEx spikes, volatility typically spikes, and so it falls, VoEx goes back into stability. And if you want a kind of a real-time play of this, I think in the past, I don't exactly remember when, but BlackBerry, I played the loan options on BlackBerry for months, and all you do is you just buy calendar spreads, because as the price rotates around this strike, volatility naturally just increases. And it's perfect. It is the most perfect options layout for calendar spreads you will ever encounter. And all you have to do while you have your option spreads or your calendar spreads open is you just have to monitor this strike to see if the options are being opened or closed. As like here, we actually see it looks like they're being closed somewhat, not terribly much, but in overall, like, the line is above. So I wouldn't really, if I had calendar spreads here, I wouldn't be too concerned yet. But so in the positive delta environments and more stable environments, as the price rotates around, volatility naturally increases. This is a double win for your calendar spreads. And then all you have to do is every once in a while, because 58,000 calls and puts aren't going to close overnight. So you literally just every few days or so, every week or so, you just have to check to see how the development of the options at that strike are doing. And then can we see, what is that, 40? No, 30. So no, it hasn't been rotating around here. So it might just be entering into, so typically when a stock is like approaching the loan calendar, VoEx starts going into the inhibition zone because the long calls start providing like significant selling pressure, but then those puts are providing significant purchasing support. But here we have a gamma squeeze. So this doesn't necessarily behave in the same manner. And I'm thinking that whereas with the long delta, you do get this nice rotating kind of mechanism. I think with the short delta, it stands to reason that doesn't actually happen. And so really we have this loan option with these now nearing in the money puts. And as we've gotten, have we appreciated? Yes, right? And so as we've approached, we see that the options changes themselves aren't that significant. So we can say, if we wanted to like quick and dirty this, we would say because the options changes. So that's actually, and another reason why I put these lines, even though sometimes they're really small, is they're really small for a reason, because we see that the overall change in the options for the past 1 month is negligible. So we can kind of assume that any change in delta over the past month is strictly due to the change in the price. And we see that we've lost a lot of long delta as the price is appreciated, which means that as we moved up, we started gaining short delta. And that means that most likely, and we can just like, this is just quick and dirty stuff. So if there's short delta, that means one of these is providing short delta. And it's probably I don't know, my brain is freezing. We go up, we get more short delta. So if those calls are giving us short delta, they're dealer short. And this tracks because as the price was lower, these puts were giving long delta. And that's why we had that long delta environment. And then the price was getting pushed up because these dealer short or these dealer long puts were in the money. So we've now pushed all of those dealer long puts out of the money. And as we did that, we were approaching short delta. And now we're in a bit of a gamma squeeze. So I don't think this is going to behave the same as the loan options in a standard, normal, healthy environment. But did everyone catch that? Because if that's kind of a cool development to watch. So we were, when a price was low. So first we see that the change in the options overall for the past month is basically negligible. So any change in delta can be associated with the change in IV or the change in price. We're going to just focus on the change in price. When the price was, where was it a month ago? 28. Or no, that was in July. It's actually not that far, but let's say here. And then as we move north, our delta has gone negative. But we were, when we were situated right in all these puts, we did have a net positive delta environment, which means those puts were providing long delta. What type of puts provide long delta? Short puts. So it makes sense that there was an aggressive kind of move to get the stock to make sure all those dealer short puts were out of the money, which seems like it has happened. But now that it has happened, we're now inundated with short delta. And it seems like the moment it happened, VoEx dipped into the propagation zone. Kind of curious. So yeah, I don't think this is going to behave like a standard loan options pattern, but definitely curious.
I find this one extremely interesting. But first, does everybody know what UUP is?
No.
UUP is the dollar index ETF. So this is basically the tradable version of the DXY. The macro nerd inside me is so excited right now. The sort of mainstream narrative over the past couple of years is that there's been a tremendous amount of money printing, but the macroeconomic story has been that that's not true, that we're entering into a global, what we've been in, a global dollar shortage. And so that's why the DXY and UUP become very, very interesting. I mean, I could ramble on for a long time, but crucially right now, China is saying that as soon as they start trading this week, they want to dump dollars to support the yuan. And so that may explain the sort of dip down into the propagation zone that we're seeing. And because of the Vanisqueeze situation, we may actually see a dip in dollars. And so
with the potential to be rather large, right? Because
yeah,
in the propagation zone, and then as well, like exactly the worst case scenario, heat map.
Yes, exactly.
Heat map ever.
And that kind of ties in nicely with a lot of the other things going on in the market. You know, I definitely don't want to influence anybody here, but I'm just thinking out loud right now. We've seen a tremendous negative correlation between the DXY and risk assets, broadly speaking. You know, so if we see DXY going up, we'll see crypto going down, stocks going down. And if we see DXY going down, showing some weakness, then we'll see crypto skyrocketing, we'll see stocks recovering. And that's kind of been generally the pattern. It doesn't always hold, but it usually does, at least over the past year, especially, right?
Right.
Because the DXY, it had been weak for most of 2020 and 2021. It kind of bottomed in, I think it double bottomed in, I believe, January and May of last year. And then it's just been on this meteoric rise. And lately, the joke has been that the DXY has been trading like a meme stock because it's just making tremendous moves every single day,
Right.
or more often than not. When for a while it was just chopping it around, chopping sideways at like 99, 100 or something like that, or in the 90s.
I'm gonna also quick thought. Do
Yeah,
meteors normally rise? Meteoric rise?
meteoric rise. Yeah.
I guess in space there is no up or down, so we could say meteors rise. That's fine. And but that was just my first thought. But that's actually interesting. I didn't know your insights are always so cool. I didn't know the correlation between the equities and VXY. And I also did not know what UUP was. And then I don't want to hype too much, but I'm going to share something from the weekly chat. Just 'cause I think it's super cool. But do you remember a long time ago, the variance of VoEx? So it was this idea that if we measure for each sector, we take the variance of VoEx and then we map it out. And we saw that as markets approached downturns, VoEx variance actually diminished. VoEx became, across all sectors, all the VoExes inside of those sectors became very similar in value. And what's cool is it seems to be pretty leading. And even if you take the running median, you see that there definitely is a downturn prior to downturns in markets. And this is especially true with the 2022, but we didn't have this data back then. But what's curious is this dashed line is the running average of all of them. And we see VoEx variance is back on the rise, which is pretty cool. And that is something that is always seen after the bottom has been reached. So we see that it starts to rise after the bottom. So not to hype up too much of the bull train. Also, if a keen observer will note that this weekly chat is 21 pages this week, I apologize, but it's mostly graphs and very cool stuff, I think. So, yeah.
So VoEx variance is suggesting that the bottom may be in and we may see a bit of a rally. And if the DXY does weaken, that's also suggesting a potential rally. Yeah. So keep an eye out on those two things. It's kind of been the narrative on FinTwit as well, saying that, we're oversold. I mean, I hate that term, but that's what they're saying, and that we may see a relief rally. It kind of ties into the sort of narrative of having a Christmas rally and like salvaging what a horrible year this has been. And potentially more weakness start of next year. So
yeah, there's a ominous figure there's in the corner, and I go into it, and that's like why the weekly chat is kind of so long, is we do a pretty in-depth dive about liquidity in the markets, because there are certain things that aren't adding up. And I think I was able to whittle it down. I think we can identify which corner the ominous figure is standing in. And so the very macro view of our environment is that there are data that suggest, there are data that suggest the bottom is in, which is a very odd statement to make, I think. But there is like this hurdle that will have to be overcome in the market. And I'm curious to see when that occurs, because it is, as you'll read in the weekly chat, it has to occur. And when it does occur, it'll be very interesting to see how the market is able to absorb that instability. But all right, guys, that's all I have for you. Thank you for coming. Do you guys have any questions, any comments? Snide remarks? No.
I thought the UUP analysis was very, very interesting. Obviously, I agree with and I agree with you. Like, don't take this data for granted and think that the bull market is back or anything like that. We are still in very challenging macro conditions. So monitor the data, watch it like a hawk. Be very careful in trading.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable.
Yeah.
Anytime, King Boo. Thanks for joining.
Justin, I think the UP segment, and if you find time to look at TLT, I think that would be extremely interesting to some very popular macroeconomic oriented Twitter accounts out there. Just throwing that out there.
I mean, I'm just throwing it out there that you have the data as well and you're well versed in it. So
that's true. That's fair.
I mean, not saying that like I'm not offloading that onto you, but I'm suggesting because you have good insights and you have good knowledge, and so it almost seems like a steal to essentially because essentially what I would be doing if I do that is just like showing my data but then using your explanations as to why it is particularly significant. And so I think it would be 100% fair and reasonable for you to apply your understanding and expertise on the data, and then since it's your expertise and your insights, you get to be the one that shares the data. I'm not particularly I give the data. You guys are kind of what brings it to life. So, but yeah, anytime, guys. Anytime. I'm gonna go probably take a quick break, but then definitely edit this 22-page monstrosity, and then yeah, that'll be about it.
Right. I'm still digesting last week's as well. The DLPs in the market. That's been interesting.
And I think do I have the DLPs have been interesting. But I think we're still maybe at the bullishness, at least on the longer term. Like we're not, although what is strange about the DLPs is this little cluster up here, which we seem to be approaching. But it is bullish or bearish on the 10-day. And I do think that any additional increases, although this is pretty similar, huh? What did the market do in June?
Relief rally.
Look at that. It's okay, so the weekly chat might be 23 pages because I actually totally forgot to mention this, and I think I might add this now. Because that is quite the other finding. And this, is still kind of reminiscent of, I don't hate, but I always get very weary when using past behavior to predict future performance, but one can't help but notice the similarities to VoEx Coiling. And if you think about it, the other week when we talked, or was it not last week, the week before that, where we didn't actually anticipated a green week, being 2 weeks off of calling the market bottom, if this does turn out to be the market bottom, is not bad. But yeah, you're right. I actually I have the memory of a goldfoot fish and I'm blind as a bat, and I actually did not even notice this similarity, which is curious.
Jim Carson in a very recent interview also started saying that, from analyzing the flow, he said his exact words were to start dollar cost averaging back into the market, because he thinks higher until the end of the year, and then maybe some more trouble at the beginning of next year. Those are pretty much his words exactly, so don't quote me. Not financial advice. I'm just going to
say that I did kind of mention that the market does have a hurdle coming up, and I don't think Is it it's 10 now, so we have 2 months. That's about reasonable to like start of the next year to have some issues, but it is reminiscent. And what's curious too is in June on QQQ, there actually no one really sold puts, definitely nowhere near as much as on SPY, but we see that that's not necessarily true currently. Huh. All right, my friends, I'm off
Justin, thank you.
as well. And
Talk to you later.
talk to you guys later. And thanks for coming, guys. I'll see you guys next time.